Okay, I want to welcome everybody tonight as we continue our Bible study on the book of Genesis. We will be in chapter number 25 tonight, which is a very diverse chapter. But first of all, why don't we go ahead and pray, and then we'll jump right in. Father, we thank you for your goodness. We thank you for your word. We thank you, Lord, for making our minds alert and clear. Help us to think clearly and responsibly about your text. Help us to learn things about your character, things that we can take and apply to our everyday lives. We give you praise in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay. I want to read the last section of chapter 24. And the reason why I want to do that is because it can kind of set us up for something else that I want to read. So we're going to read beginning in verse 61. We're just going to reread what we went over last week. This is basically where Rebekah is brought back with Abraham's servant, and she's going to encounter or meet Isaac, whom she knows that she is going to marry. And I don't know, I didn't point it out, and nobody else spoke up about it or asked a question about it that I recall, but didn't it seem odd that when they returned, the servant didn't return to Abraham? Or at least the text doesn't tell us that he did. It just simply has the servant returning from Syria to where Isaac was. And the way the story reads, it's like there was no interaction with Abraham. Because of that, some scholars have insinuated that possibly Abraham was dead at the time that the servant returns with Rebekah. However, a careful analysis and attention to the text will render that conclusion an impossibility. And I'll show you that simple math can eliminate that as potential. And so let's read this, and then we'll kind of go through some of the proposals. I'll actually pull up an excerpt from the Word Biblical Commentary, which I believe is one of the top 2 scholarly commentaries that are available on Genesis, and show you that even in a commentary that I have learned a lot from, it's good to consult other commentaries, because clearly he draws the conclusion that it's literally impossible. Math makes it impossible. So I'm going to show that to you, and I'm not showing you to point out, that this commentary is bad, because it's a great, great commentary. I would recommend everyone getting it. Let's read this text. Verse 61. And Rebekah arose and her damsels, and they rode upon the camels and followed the man. And the servant took Rebekah and went his way. And Isaac came from the way of the well, Lachairoi, for he dwelt in the south country. That would be in the Negev. Let me see if I can pull it up on my map. That would be right down in here in the Negev, which is south of where they spent a lot of time. Beersheba, they spent time at Beersheba, the plains of Mamre. And so it has them returning to the well that was mentioned earlier, where Hagar experienced the angel of the Lord. Verse 63 says, And Isaac went out to meditate in the field at the eventide, and he lifted up his eyes and saw, and behold, the camels were coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes when she saw Isaac. She lighted off the camel, for she had said unto the servant, What man is this that walketh in the field to meet us? And the servant said, It is my master. Therefore she took a veil, covered herself. The servant told Isaac all things that he had done. And Isaac brought her into his mother Sarah's tent, and took Rebekah. And she became his wife, and he loved her. And Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. And so I wanted to read that passage to show you that it is unusual that the servant would bring Rebekah directly to Isaac and there be no mention of him coming back to Abraham. Because you would think the natural thing for him to do would be like, hey, God came through. It was amazing. It was a prosperous journey. Everything fell into place. But he doesn't. He returns there. But at the end of it, it very clearly says that Isaac took Rebekah and went into Sarah's tent, and he was comforted concerning her death, which helps us to have a valuable piece of information, because when did the text say that Sarah died? When she was how old? 127 years old, right? The text will say here in chapter 25 that we'll read later on, says that Isaac was 40 when he marries Rebekah. So that tells us that the story of the arranging of his marriage had to have taken place within a 3-year window, right? Between the death of Sarah and when Isaac turns 40. Okay, he was 37 when she died. He was 40 when he marries. So, could Abraham have been dead when Isaac was married? The story that we read tonight will tell us that Abraham lives to be 175. Abraham would have been how old when Isaac married? 140, right? Isaac marries when he's 40. Abraham was 100 when he had Isaac, which would make him 140 when Isaac marries, which means he couldn't be dead because he lives 35 more years. Correct? Another piece of information that we'll see as we read through chapter 25 is that when Isaac has his sons, twins, Jacob and Esau, which we'll read here in just a moment, he's 60 years old, which means not only was Abraham alive when Isaac got married, but he was also alive when his grandsons were born. What is very amazing, considering how important all of these figures are historically to the Jews and to us as Christians, is there is absolutely no stories in Genesis about Isaac and Rebekah in relation to Abraham, or Abraham in relation to his 2 grandsons, which I would think, considering the amount of time that has been spent talking about the promise made to Abraham, it would be a really great thing to include that, hey, Abraham's seen his grandsons born as well. It's just simply not there. Okay, but let's look right quick at an excerpt from the Word Biblical Commentary. This is an explanation after the first section, which is verses 1 through 11 of chapter 25. And this is what it says. And obviously I've disagreed with the comment here, but it says, or at least part of it, it is easy to conclude from the opening remark, Abraham married again, that this section describes the widower Abraham remarrying after the death of his first wife, Sarah. However, the description of Keturah as a concubine and a closer examination of the context of this account make this improbable. Where the order of stories in Genesis is strictly chronological, the account of Abraham's death should not be mentioned till chapter 25 and verse 26 at the earliest. Clearly, it's not in chronological order, and we've already discovered that Hebrew narratives do not go in chronological order. They continue a thought, complete a thought, and move on to the next story. it says in chapter 24 implies that Abraham died while his servant was away in Mesopotamia. That is impossible. Math makes it impossible because the text clearly says he was married at age 40 and Abraham didn't die until he was 175. It is a mathematic impossibility. And what's amazing, and what this would show us, is that this commentator wrote his commentary as he went through the text. And as he went through the text, he overlooked what is clearly stated in the latter text and didn't go back and amend it. And sometimes you will see commentaries that will go and amend themselves. So I look for this commentary to do that, given that it's one of the highest end commentaries. But certainly Abraham would have been alive when Isaac married Rebekah. Okay? It goes on to say the stories are arranged to describe the careers of the main actors as clearly as possible and illuminate the fulfillment of the promises. And I agree with that, clearly. For these reasons, it seems most likely that the editor understood Abraham's marriage to Keturah to have occurred much earlier in his life. I disagree with that. But the description of it has been delayed until this point so as not to detract from the main line of the story. Now, I agree with, wanting to keep intact the storyline and the plot of the book, but I don't believe that Abraham has married Keturah earlier on in his life, and it simply is just saved until this point to bring out or highlight the fact that he was married to Keturah. Okay, now I want to stop reading that for right now because it's going to give away some of the stuff that we're going to read in the actual text, so I'm going to change it so you can't peek at it. But I do want to show you something else. This was in the Word Biblical Commentary, and I thought this was noteworthy. If you'll look at the Word document I have, this is a highlight. It says, although this section looks like a ragbag of traditions about Abraham that have been appended here because they do not really fit anywhere else, and there's an element of truth to that. It should be noted that the three major cycles of patriarchal stories about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all end similarly. Now, I want you to look. It has the death and burial of the wife, and then it has Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And then it has the son's marriage, same pattern. Then the list of descendants, death and burial of the patriarch, and then the list of descendants, at least in two of the stories. And this is the family history of, or the generations of, right here in the first two and not in Jacob. Because when we get to Jacob at the end of his life, the story is really centered on what's taking place in Egypt. And so the storyline has really changed and setting us up for the second book in our Bible, which is the book of Exodus. Okay? What it says in relation to the reality of how everything is framed in Genesis is these parallels suggest purposeful editorial activity, and I would agree with that. The way it's formulated, how it's put in the order that it reads, at least. Furthermore, the material here appears to be old, which means the source material would date back to Moses, contrary to a lot of opinions of modern scholars. And it gives the reason why. It appears to be old and reflects a situation in which Israel enjoyed good relations with her neighbors in Arabia and the desert lands to the east. We're going to see who those people groups are and where they came from tonight. But significantly, the passage never calls them Arabs, a term that did not come into use until the 9th century BC, which would be somewhere around the time of David. And there are some people who will date portions of Genesis till even after the exile, which I think is really cheating and stretching. I do believe there was editing that took place, but some go as far as to say that parts that were actually written in Genesis as like originating or different authors can date to the time of the exile, and it clearly says that this shows that it's old because it doesn't use terms that would be later terms, say, around the time of the exile and closer to the time of Christ. Okay? So it goes on to say, from the time of the wilderness wanderings through the period of the judges, the Midianites troubled Israel. But earlier, Moses had fled to Midian and married the daughter of a Midianite priest. And I will bring that to light where the Midianites come from, as we'll read. He goes on to say, no trace of later animosity between Midian and Israel is detectable in this genealogy. This suggests it is old. And it's not that genealogy there. We'll look at that again here in just a moment. But we need to read the text for it to make any sense. Okay? So let's start in chapter 25. And chapter 25 can be broken up into 3 sections. Verses 1 through 11 deals with basically, okay, here's what happened to Abraham. We're done with him. Let's move on to Isaac and his family. But inserted in the middle from verses 12 to 18 is the genealogy of Ishmael. Okay, so he's not totally forgotten. He reappears here, and that's what we're going to see. Verse 1, then again Abraham took a wife, or literally in the Hebrew it says, and Abraham added and took a wife. And her name was Keturah. And she bare him. Now, if we are to view this as happening after Sarah's death, which I believe that's how it needs to be understood, he would be marrying Keturah minimally at the age of 137 years. So he's marrying late in life. And not only that, watch what it says in verse 2. And she bare him Zimran, Yokshan, Medan, and Midian. This word here that reads in English, Midian, is the progenitor of the people group that we'll see a lot throughout the rest of the Torah and really the Old Testament as the Midianites. If you remember the story of Joseph being sold to, in some places it calls them the Midianites, in some places it calls them the Ishmaelites. And the reason why is the descendants of Ishmael and the descendants of Midian, the Midianites, kind of intermarry and have a closer relationship. We'll see the explanation of why here in just a moment. But this is where the Midianites come from. And it goes on to say Yishbak and Shuach. Now what's interesting is this word here, Shuach, is a term that appears in the book of Job. I believe it refers to one of Job's friends by the name of Bildad. It says Bildad was a descendant of Shuach, which helps us date the book of Job. The book of Job had to have been after the timing of what we're reading. So it would be after, obviously, this descendant of Abraham through Keturah, Shuach, grows up, becomes a man, and basically fathers a group of nomads that are raised under the familial name of Shuach. And they would be Shuachit or Shuachit would be what you would call them, kind of like the Israelites. So you have the Shuahites, or however you would say it in English. But I thought that's very interesting. Not only that, in verse 3 it says, and Yokshan begot Shiva and Dedan. Both of those names appear as people groups as well in the book of Job. So that's a lot of weight that helps us date the book of Job, because you have 3 names that are mentioned that are all connected to the same time frame which means that the book of Job, or the character of Job, not the book, let me say the character of Job, the actual person Job, would have lived probably around 2 generations after Abraham. So he would have lived around the same time as Jacob and Jacob's sons, as basically the 12 patriarchs who would become the tribal heads of Israel. Job would have been existing at the same time that they're all ending up in Egypt, and you have the story building and unfolding of the Israelites being in Egypt 400 years. Meanwhile, Job, another descendant of Abraham, will settle eastward, and we have his life recorded in the book of Job as well. So I believe that Job, this is my opinion, Job is a descendant of Abraham who comes from probably one of these people groups of these 6 sons that are born to Abraham, and he settles in the area east of what we know as Israel. So it goes on and says, and the sons of Dedan were Ashurim and Letushim and Leumim. And it goes on and says in verse 4, and the sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, and Chanoch. This word Chanoch is the same word that is spelled Enoch back in Genesis. The same Hebrew name, Chanoch, which means dedicating or training, but it's transliterated here as it really should be, Chanoch. And then it goes on to list Avidah and Eldaah. Now, what's interesting is it, in conclusion, it says all these were the children of Keturah. Now, I want to bring up that Word document that I had up a while ago, and I want you to look at it. Okay, so you have Abraham and Keturah, and they have 6 sons that are listed along here. But it picks 2 of the sons and further gives names of sons that were born to Midian. Why would he be more important? Because the Israelites will have lots of dealings with the Midianites throughout the rest of the stories in the Old Testament. And then you have Yokshan, who it mentions 2 sons and even grandsons, sons of Dedan, as well. And the reason why is simply we see reoccurrences of these people groups in relation to the Israelites, which means we need to remember that the Torah was written originally to who? And for who? The 21st century, right? Because it's all about us. No, it was written to the Israelites who were in the process of going through the wilderness to conquer some of the people groups that are being named throughout some of these narratives. Not necessarily in this situation, but they're at least familiar characters that the Israelites will know and be familiar with. Now let's go back to our text, and it says in verse 5, so he has 6 more sons. So Abraham is getting the job done. After he's 137 years of age, he has 6 more sons. And watch what it says in verse 5. And Abraham gave all that he had unto Isaac. Well, how do you think that would make the other 6 sons plus Ishmael feel? That would create what? Animosity, jealousy, envy, hatred, strife, fill in the blank. There's a lot of things that it would create. It would certainly create division. It would cause them to have some level of disdain for Isaac. So let's kind of do a little pause and reflect effect. Who hates the Jewish people more than anyone? People in what area of the world? In the Middle East. Watch what happens here in verse 6. But unto the sons of the concubines, notice it says concubines, which would include Ishmael, which Abraham had, Abraham gave gifts. Yeah, rich Abraham. He gave gifts to the 7 sons and gives everything else to Isaac. Not only that, watch what he does. And sent them away from Isaac, his son, while he yet lived, eastward into the east country. Now, let's pull up a map, even though you really should be able to see this visually in your mind. But let's see here. Let's zoom out here. This is kind of a more visual of what is Israel right here. But what is to the east of Israel? Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Syria. So, it says that Abraham gave everything to Isaac in front of these other kids, gives them all a gift, and kicks them out in the desert. Do you realize what is east of Israel? Worse land and harsher climates. I mean, barrenness, desert. Worse than anything that we have in America. I mean, New Mexico has nothing on the desert that he pretty much said, hey, Isaac's getting everything, so you guys just need to head out east. Get out of here. Here's your gift. Go. Now, where in the world are the people groups that hate the Jews? East of Israel, in Arabia, Iraq, Iran, in the same areas. So these people groups would have settled throughout that area. And they would have carried that animosity, that disdain, because they were also descendants of Abraham. And we know that Islam can be traced to the people of Ishmael, because Islam was birthed where? In Arabia. And so you can see logically how this would come to be, and how you would have this division even 4,000 years later, because each generation, things build if we don't deal with them. And Abraham getting in the flesh is the cause of it. Right? So it shows us even back here in the book of Genesis that getting off in the flesh will cost. It will cost. Okay, now let's keep reading. Verse 7 at the top. And these are the days of the years of Abraham's life which he lived, 163 years, which would be what? 175. Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man, full of years, and was gathered to his people. Verse 9 explains how. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, and Ishmael, and they buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, which is before Mamre. So we see that Ishmael wasn't totally estranged from Abraham, like you could easily jump to that conclusion based on how he's kind of kicked out. But clearly he has interaction and is peaceable enough at this point that they can bury their father together in the cave that he purchased to bury Sarah in. Okay, verse 10 explains that. The field which Abraham purchased of the sons of Heth, there was Abraham buried and Sarah his wife. And it came to pass after the death of Abraham that God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac dwelt by the well Lachairoi. Now, the scene changes here from verses 12 through 18, and it does what we've seen it do throughout the book of Genesis. It's going to give the family history of the non-elect line. In other words, the child that was not preferred. Remember what we've seen in the Table of the Nations? You see Japheth and Ham, their descendants listed, and it ends with Shem. Why? Because through Shem, God would choose Abraham. We see the same thing here. It's going to list the generations of Ishmael, and then it's going to move to the lineage of the promised seed, which is Isaac. So let's read through this. Now these are the generations of Ishmael, Abraham's son, whom Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's handmaid, bare unto Abraham. Clearly, verse 12 would be an editor adding all these details, because we kind of know by now that, Hagar is an Egyptian, that she's Sarah's handmaid, and that she bare unto Abraham. Okay, so this would be likely a scribe just adding details. Verse 13, and these are the names of the sons of Ishmael by their names according to their generations. The firstborn of Ishmael, Neviot. I'm going to read them. I'm going to scroll over them and read them in Hebrew because they're harder to read in English. Neviot, Kedar, Adbeel, Mivsam, Mishma. The only problem with that is it's super tiny. Duma and Masa. Chadar, Tema. Tema is also mentioned in the book of Job. So we have another name to add to the list that helps us date the book of Job as well. Okay, and the rest of the sons, Yetur, Naphish, and Kedma. These are the sons of Ishmael, and these are their names by their towns and by their castles. The word castles here, basically a fortified battle encampment would be more appropriate for our understanding, because when we think of castles, we think of like this tower-like, majestic type structure. They were nomads, so that certainly wouldn't be the case. They would be encampments, kind of like what we see with the Israelites as they go through the wilderness. 12 princes according to their nations, which is interesting that you would have Ishmael end up with 12 as well. Verse 17, these are the years of the life of Ishmael, 137 years. And he gave up the ghost and died, and was gathered unto his people, and they dwelled from the land of Havilah unto Shur, that is before Egypt, as you goest towards Assyria, or Ashur. And he died in the presence of all his brethren. So if we were to zone in here, basically through this area, through the Sinai Peninsula, basically from the border all the way through here into Arabia in this area as well. Now it moves into what is a long section extending into chapters 35, 36, which began with Isaac. And what's amazing is not a whole lot is said about Isaac, really, considering how much is said about Jacob and Abraham and Joseph. Not a whole lot is said about Isaac's life, especially because he lives to be a very old man. So he must have been a boring character. Verse 19, and these are the generations of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begat Isaac. And Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah to wife, the daughter of Bethuel the Syrian. The word Syrian there is actually Arami, which means he was Aramaean or Aramaic, is how that would be more properly understood. The daughter of Bethuel the Aramaic of Padanaram. Notice that we have a change of the name, which was called Haran or Nahor was the location names prior to now, but all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we have a different name, which means either a scribe amended it to a more current name place, which is known as an anachronism. It's basically, okay, they're not really familiar with Haran, which that never really ceased to be, so it's odd, especially odd in this situation, because Haran was known and was always known as a place name for that region. So for whatever reason, and really it's a mystery to even scholars, why they would insert the name Padan Aram, and the only conclusion that they can come to is, see here, we have proof that there's a different source writing in the book of Genesis. And, it is some evidence that possibly may be the case. Okay, so it says of Padan Aram, the sister to Laban the Syrian. Why would it mention that? Kind of like it did earlier. Remember, it kind of threw out the name of Rebekah, and then a couple chapters later, we understood why. The same thing's going to happen here. It kind of throws out the name of Laban, because Laban is going to become a very prominent figure in the rest of Genesis later on. Verse 21, and Isaac entreated the Lord, or supplicated in prayer, the Lord for his wife, because she was barren. And the Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Now, if you just read that verse, you would think, man, he prayed, and God just miraculously met the need. She was barren, he prayed, boom, she goes to having kids. Now, I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to tell you that several years pass. He gets married when he's 40, and his children are born when he's 60. That's not quickly answering a prayer. At least if he's praying earlier on, it doesn't tell us exactly when he starts praying. But in their culture, they didn't have birth control, and they didn't wait around to have kids. That was their goal, especially when you're the promised son of Abraham, the one who's been given all these extravagant promises of, basically having children and filling the earth. You'd kind of be excited about being part of that. So it just shows you that sometimes if we pay attention to the detail, several years pass before he gets the answer to prayer. Verse 21, and Isaac entreated the Lord for his wife because she was barren. The Lord was entreated of him, and Rebekah his wife conceived. Verse 22, and the children struggled together within her. The word struggled there is really, it's the Hebrew word, which taken from the root word ritzatz. It's a violent term, like to smash or to crush. So there's a lot of activity going on inside of Rebekah as they struggle together. And she said, if so, why am I thus? So she's basically saying, what is going on? There's this promise going on. I'm finally with child. She obviously wouldn't know. They didn't have ultrasounds back in the day. So she didn't know she had 2 children in there. She just knows, man, something chaotic is going on here inside of my belly. And what is going on? If the Lord has answered the prayer, then why in the world, is all this rambunctiousness going on inside? And she went to inquire of the Lord. And watch what is said in verse 23. The Lord said unto her, 2 nations are in your womb. The word womb there is actually batan, which means belly. 2 nations are in your belly. And 2 manner of people shall be separated from your bowels. Literally, your entrails, your intestines. That's how they understood it. So the Lord spoke to them the way they understood. And the reason why bowels would be used here is because, children are born out of the same location that women excrete and go to the bathroom. So they're coming from the belly. They're coming from the same place. They didn't know how anatomy worked back in the day. And that's just how they understood. And what I love is God was okay with their level of understanding, and he talked to them through that level of understanding. I love it. And I believe that God's the same today. He will talk to us on our level of understanding so that we can relate to him. Okay, so he says there are 2 nations, 2 manner of people will be separated, and the one people shall be stronger than the other people. So obviously these 2 sons represent people groups. Watch what it said. And the elder shall serve the younger. How can that be if they're twins? How did they determine who was the eldest? Who came out first? And so it said, the elder, the one who will be the elder, shall serve the younger. There's a lot of history repeating itself in that phrase too, because you have that as a recurring theme all throughout the Bible. Verse 24, and when her days to be delivered were fulfilled, behold, there were twins in her womb. Again, without the Lord speaking this prophecy over her, this would have been quite the surprise. Verse 25, and the first came out red. Now, what's frustrating is in the English, there is hidden all of the wordplay that's going on in the actual Hebrew text that would really highlight certain aspects of the rest of this narrative. And I'll try to point that out if y'all are okay. I don't want to bore y'all to death, but it really is significant. Okay, it says, and the first came out red. I'm going to highlight that word. The word red is the Hebrew word taken from the root word Adam, which is how the first man, Adam, was given the title to himself. Because Adam, he was taken from the dirt, which is what color? Red. So it says the first was Adamoni, which means he was red. And it says all over like a hairy garment. There would be more word plays there. Se'ar, because Seir becomes another name that is connected to Esau, who we know as Esau. A lot of these things are hard to explain if you're not familiar with the languages. So if I confuse you, just forget it, okay? But it says that he's hairy. So you have this first son who's red, which would likely be indicating his complexion. A lot of people have proposed that he was red-headed, but red-headed Hebrews, probably not, because they're dark-skinned, dark-eyed, and dark-headed. Okay, they're of a different group than us European Americans. Okay, so he likely would have been red in his complexion, just like King David. King David would not have had red hair. It just is not very likely. You're not fair complected and red headed out in the desert. It just doesn't work that way. Okay, But nonetheless, he was a hairy little guy. And they called his name Esau, or Esav in Hebrew. Verse 26, and after that came his brother out, and his hand took a hold on Esau's heel. The word heel is akev. And so, because he grabbed a hold of Esau's heel, akev, his name was called Jacob, or Yaakov, taken from the same root. And it literally means one who follows at the heel. So you see this ongoing struggle that was depicted going on inside her, carrying on as the firstborn burst through, and the second child has a hold of his heel. I meant, what imagery that we have here. And so his name was called Yaakov, one who follows at the heel. And Isaac was 80 years old when she bare them. Okay? So, 60. Verse 27. And the boys grew, and Esau was a cunning hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob was a plain man, or literally, Tom is the word, or Tom, which means mature, or complete, consistent man, dwelling in tents, which would indicate that he was like his father and grandfather in that he was a herdsman. He was a nomad. He was a shepherd, is what this would be saying. But watch what happens here in verse 28. And Isaac loved Esau, or Esau, because he did eat of his venison, or literally in the Hebrew, because his venison was in his mouth. Because, again, Esau was a mighty hunter, and so he brought the spoils, or the kill, home for Isaac, who happened to love meat. So it says Isaac loved Esau because he did eat of his venison, and then it also says, but Rebekah loved Jacob. And like, it doesn't tell us why she loved Jacob, but what you see in a lot of homes where you have one parent favors one, the other parent will feel sorry for the other one and favor them to make up for the favoritism of the spouse towards the other child. Most of us can probably relate or know of a situation that's familiar to this. So basically you have Isaac who favors Esau because he likes Esau's hunting skills and the meat that comes, and Rebekah likely feels kind of sorry for Jacob and favors him. Or she could be remembering the promise. The elder shall be a slave or a servant to the younger. So she's like, obviously the younger one's going to be favored in this deal, so I'm kind of going to gravitate towards liking him the most. Now the story goes on and basically is fitting of what was prophesied over them. Verse 29. And Jacob sawed pottage, or he made, you could say, stew, like a stew type of a boiling of food type of a dish. We would equate it to like soup or stew of some sort. Watch what happens in verse 29. And Esau came from the field, and he was faint. Ayef, he was tired, exhausted. He had been out hunting. But watch what he does. And I believe we can learn a valuable lesson here. Verse 30. And Esau said to Jacob, feed me, I pray thee, with that same red pottage. Now, remember, he came out red in complexion. He was also hairy. And then he comes in from the field, and we have the same word that appears again. And notice over in the Hebrew, it's actually put in there twice. Min ha'adom ha'adom, which is referring to the color of the food that he had prepared. And he says, feed me with that, for I am faint. And then it tells us, therefore his name was called Edom, or we say Edom. Now, what's interesting, if you look on any any of the old maps of Israel and the surrounding area, the location that Edom settles in, or Esau settles in, is always named what? Edom, or Edom, or Edom in English we say. And a people group emerged from him called who? The Edomites, which are a people group that actually try to hinder the Israelites from passing through Jordan to ultimately go into the land of Canaan. Okay, so it tells us how he got his name. He's out hunting, he comes in, he sees the red soup looking being made, and he desires it, and so he kind of gets tagged or labeled with this another name, Edom, okay, which is taken from the same root as Adam, and his color, Adamoni. Verse 20 or 31 says, and Jacob said, Jacob's like, I'm going to take advantage of this. He said, sell me this day your birthright. B'choah. Sell me your birthright. Now, what would be significant about that? The firstborn received the birthright in the ancient Near East. And part of the deal of having the birthright is you got a double portion of inheritance. So it would be something to be desired. And so Jacob's like, you want some soup? Let's make a deal. You sell me your birthright for a bowl of soup. And you would think, no deal. No. You get double the inheritance of a rich man for a bowl of soup? That is a crappy deal. Right? You would think. But watch what happens. Verse 32. Esau said, behold, I am at the point to die. What's he doing? Living by how he feels. Living in the moment. Being dominated and controlled by what? His flesh. Is he really going to die? Of course not. But he's thinking irrationally. Why? Because he is controlled and dominated by his fleshly desires. And when you're controlled by your fleshly desires, what do? Stupid things that you regret. Right? So, this is his rationale. I am at the point to die, and what profit shall the this birthright do to me? In other words, his rationale is, I'm going to die if I don't get some soup. And if I die, what good is the birthright going to be if I die? I'd rather have half of the inheritance and stay alive. Irrational thinking. So, watch what happens. Verse 33. Jacob said, swear to me this day. And he sware unto him. And he sold his birthright unto Jacob. So he, for a moment of pleasure, he forfeited much of his future. And that's what we do when we get in the flesh. We alter our future because we live in the moment for the gratification of the moment. We could think of a million parallels that we could equate to today, especially in our culture. So Jacob really scores big on this situation, because he concludes saying in verse 34, and Jacob gave Esau bread. He felt sorry enough, he gave him some bread too. He gave Esau some bread and pottage of lentils. Like, this wasn't meaty soup. This wasn't even high quality soup. You sold your birthright for a bowl of lentils. It's insane. And he did eat and drink and rose up and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright. The moment his belly was full, he went, what an idiot. I wasn't going to die. I was just tired, carnal, and I made a dumb decision. And immediately, undoubtedly, immediately, he would have regretted it and would have blamed Jacob. That's what carnal people do. They don't own it. They don't take responsibility. They blame someone else. You know, and it was kind of a jerkish thing for Jacob to do. I mean, to take advantage of his brother like he did, but, you know, he didn't force him. And he sold his inheritance, the greater inheritance, for a bowl of soup and a moment of satisfaction, a moment of gratification. So that's a lesson that we can all learn. Don't make dumb decisions when you're tired. I don't know about you, but I can relate. If I'm tired, I don't make as good of decisions. I'll be more relaxed in my decisions. Same thing could be said like if you're kind of stressed. Don't make major decisions when you're stressed because you're going to be more relaxed. You're not going to think as clearly and likely make a decision that later on you're going to regret. So we're going to stop right there, and I want to give you an opportunity, if you have any questions about what we've read, to ask at this time. Gary?
I don't understand 29 through 34 where Edom comes in there. They just mention it once in 30, but he's never called Edom again in that rest. Who's called Edom?
Esau.
Esau? But
Esau.
they don't use that name again as he's referred to as Esau.
That name will be used interchangeably for him, especially the people group that come from him. They don't call the people group that comes from Esau the Esauites. You won't find that anywhere in the Bible, but you will see Edomites. So, you know, likely what happened is that become a nickname, and probably came from Jacob, because he's the one who had the red suit that he tricked him with. So likely from this day forward, and partially why Esau despised his birthright, and we're taking a little liberty and reading into the text something that may not be there. Just thought I'd throw that little disclaimer out. But likely Jacob started calling Edom, and that was kind of like, boom, I tricked you, dude. I got your birthright. And so every time he heard Edom, he was reminded of the dumb decision he made, and therefore resentment and anger would have built because of what Jacob did to him. So, but the name stuck nonetheless because the people group that emerged from Esau were known as the Edomites.
Isn't the term therefore meaning a result of? And the way I read that is, it says, for I am weary, therefore his name was called Edom. It has nothing to do with being weary?
Therefore is an English word.
Got it.
Yeah.
Trying to put the wrong.
In Hebrew it says al-ken. Upon thus was his name called Edom, more appropriately, Edom. Any other questions?
Regarding the other sons of Abraham, what was the purpose in sending them away? Is it a cultural thing? It's typical? I mean,
I believe this was to safeguard the promise. This was probably Abraham trying to take the initiative in himself to protect Isaac and the promise that would be contingent upon Isaac. And, you know, we don't know for sure, but presumably he could have seen that many sons as a threat to the promise continuing. And so he's protecting the promise. But in protecting the promise, naturally it's going to cause problems. Anytime you have children that feel rejected, it's going to create problems.
I've heard it said that Jacob means liar. Where did you get that from?
People draw that conclusion because of the character and the behavior that you see in Jacob. But far as his name, Yaakov, clearly the text shows us that his name is given because he grabs a hold of the heel of Esau, which is Akev in Hebrew. Yaakov takes the same root and makes a name out of it. That was very common. We've seen that throughout Genesis so far, and it was a common thing that they did in Hebrew. But literally one who follows at the heel, Yaakov. Now he was quite the little trickster, though.
Was it a part of God's plan like this? Because why Jacob went on to be, and bring his sons and Joseph and all of that happened. If Esau had actually ended up with the birthright, what would have happened?
I don't think manipulation would be part of God's plan. I believe, just like as in the case of Abraham, trying to help God out, when ultimately if they would have just trusted God, it would have worked out in a better way. But yeah, I can't see God desiring manipulation. Just don't see that in God's character.
I know this is ahead of the game, but you think that's why he scored Leia?
You reap what you sow. And he reaped a big harvest. I mean, he didn't just get ripped off by getting Leia. I mean, he worked 14 years for 2 women, one of which he didn't even want. And then he worked 7 more years for livestock and was getting his wages changed throughout that process. We'll read all of that. So yeah, he definitely reaped what he had sown. And the trickster was tricked later on in life. So what goes around comes around. You will have a harvest.
Is there not more going on in the story of Jacob and Esau? Literally just was hungry.
As far as what?
It just seems illogical for someone to do that.
I believe it's showing how basically the prophecy would be played out and why the elder would be a slave to the younger, because of his behavior, his irrational behavior, because it is very irrational. And certainly there's, I'm sure, a lot of details that aren't left out, as in most stories, but he makes a very rash, carnal, fleshly decision. And actually Paul borrows from this story, this analogy, in his writings to the church at Galatia. And he basically talks about how Esau represents the flesh and how Jacob represents the spirit. And so I would encourage everyone to go read that story, since this is so fresh, because he borrows this story to make a point about those who trust in the flesh and those who trust in the spirit, which obviously, it'd be a stretch to say Jacob was being led of the spirit here, but but in the end he does become, submissive to God and allows God to work through his life.
Do you
And-
think they're really whipping up on each
That's what it says. It uses a very rarely used term, which is indicative of violence. Smashing, literally.
Maybe Jacob is supposed to come out first.
Basically, what I draw from knowing the words used there is they're headbutting in the womb, so to speak. You know, obviously they don't know what they're doing. It's something that was just happening as a struggle, and you know, it gave rise to the prophecy that is spoken over them ultimately. But I don't think there was certainly any maliciousness on either of their parts in the womb. It just happened, and it gave to the prophecy, which is basically the setting the stage for what's going to follow in their lives, what we're going to see. Because we're going to see that their entire lives and existence is a struggle.
It is interesting though, because most times when twins are born, they're like this, they're just really close growing up.
When you have parents that favor one child or the other, it creates problems. So the error is rooted in the parents. I've seen it done a lot. And it doesn't work out well usually, for at least one of the children. Usually the one that is not favored, there are devastating effects. I've seen children who were rejected become participate in alternative type lifestyles because they're looking for acceptance or what they think is love in some other avenue. Like I've seen kids who were rejected or not favored, the one that was not favored, turn circles of homosexuality or just, you know, what we would say would be very alternative type lifestyles. Because they're looking for acceptance somewhere because they didn't get it at home. Any other questions?